election of 1877 was an exciting time for the people of Deadwood. It was a fulfillment of a promise and a hope where these people finally became part of a representative democracy.
It also had the impact of creating a true sense of community. And so you see the establishment of a school, you see the establishment of churches.
Suddenly there was a kind of civilizing thing happening, and the theatre was very much about that. And I think Langrish was particularly good at that. That was his real gift, going into these camps and actually giving a focus.
With George Hurst's prediction that he would be mining for at least 25 years, that offered stability, and people began to see the value of putting down roots here. All that became possible because of being able to have elections and legitimate government.
With the Hills now part of the new territory, I run for sheriff of the new organized county.
Part of the notion of getting elections in 1877, and when a first county-wide election was held, was to get a locally controlled government. February 1877, the Black Hills is taken from the Sioux, and suddenly you have this area that's part of Dakota Territory. You've got to create counties, and that's what the territorial government in Yankton wants to do. And then the governor, Governor Pennington, gets to appoint the county commissioners and all of their officials.
A lot of the merchants and miners in the Black Hills did not trust one little bit the Yankton politicians. Most of the politicians were Republicans. A lot of the miners were Democrats. With Pennington appointing all Republicans, there's a lot of suspicion that took place.
The people in Yankton running the territory were called as the Yankton Ring, and they were in this business of being in government for personal profit. And the people that were perceived to be appointed to these positions in Lawrence County were there for their own personal gain.
Fucking Yanktons rejoined us, for Christ's fucking sake.
Must have finished stealing from the Indians.
You're in Deadwood, these people are appointed from Yankton, and you don't like it. And so you start demanding immediately elections.
Judge Granville Bennett becomes the first territorial judge here, and he comes in and he goes, wait a second, Pennington, you can't appoint these commissioners, we have to have elections. Thus began the 1877 election campaign for county commissioners and for the sheriff.
Don't insult him again.
You being this kind of neutral sheriff is why I'm gonna vote for Harry Manning.
Now, the most important race of the 1877 election as far as the Deadwood series goes is the race between Seth Bullock and John Manning. Seth Bullock was appointed sheriff by Governor Pennington. He was a local person, and this should have made the locals happy, but yet not totally. They were still angry at the appointees in general. Well, the election of 1877 comes. Bullock, who's a Republican, and his associates get together and form what they call the People's Party. They want to get as far as they can from the Republican label.
John Manning was running for the Democratic Party. Now, John Manning was an Irish Democrat. He ran a livery. He was hardworking, an affable sort.
He had come to Deadwood and had been involved in the civic improvements. He'd been with the foreman of the fire department. More telling for Manning is that he ran a saloon called the Senate Saloon with a partner, and he was very popular.
A lot of the campaigning took place in the newspapers. In fact, the Miner newspaper and the Herald were created specifically to air the Democratic Party's point of view.
You see at least two newspapers heavily involved. One takes Manning's side, one takes Bullock's side. And the reading of the paper that favors Bullock is they're responding a lot to these charges. And when you've been in office, even for 9 months, you have to defend what you do, and Bullock was in a defensive posture.
He wants to know what we're here for. We're here for the election. Maybe gonna exercise a franchise.
Time for us to speak now, Sheriff.
Have they told you yet who you're voting for?
Not yet.
Sheriff.
Shut up, Harry.
You get to the election day and rumors are rampant of what they call repeaters, people that vote more than once, and both sides were accused of buying votes, and I'm sure they did. I mean, don't you technically buy a vote when you buy somebody a drink?
There are all kinds of accusations flying on both sides that ballots were stolen and that people that couldn't vote were voting. And when it was all said and done, Manning had won the day.
How do you think you might enjoy private life?
Sturgis?
970 votes for Harry Manning, 68 votes for Mr. Bullock.
I believe that Manning was seen by the working man as more of a popular figure, somebody they could relate to. Bullock was more seen as an elitist, more stern.
He really upset a lot of people because of his inflexibility. It was impossible for him to bend.
Not only did his attributes of personality manage to get him defeated, which no one had anticipated, but the rampant bribery and buying of votes that took place so outraged him that he abandoned the high ground and tried to buy votes himself and was simply outbought.
Bullock was so pissed off about this whole election and the outcome that he refused to turn over the keys to the jail and went to his ranch in Belfouche and stayed there.
He essentially nullified the election, said, "Fuck you, I'm still the sheriff."
Sheriff Manning tries to go over and get the records from Bullock, and he won't give them to him. And ultimately, they appeal to the Dakota Territory Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules, yeah, your official, the people that were elected, turn over the jail. As soon as the court ruling came down, Bullock then turns over the jail. But from early November to late December, you have these two different governments working in Deadwood, which fits for Deadwood.
We have a special guest with us today, Miss Jane Cannery.
An Indian scout.
By July of 1876, the population of children had started to grow, but they were all kind of running amok. The Pioneer reported that a group of people had gotten together and said, "We need a school."
About 1877, they finally got a young lady who said, "Well, I'll learn them $1 a head a week."
Her name was Minnie Callison, and she was well educated and she had taught previously. And they started the first school. She got involved with one of the local illicit couples. She found out information that was detrimental to her health. So our first school teacher was bludgeoned to death one night with a hammer. When they were doing the investigation, they found that she had a pistol beneath her pillow. So not only was our first school teacher bludgeoned to death with a hammer, she was a pistol packing woman.
Morning.
Good morning, Sophia.
Good morning. Will we bake bread again today?
Is it your vote we should?
Yes.
I read more about the kindergarten movement than I thought I would have to read before I was relegated to one of the circles of hell. Martha Bullock was, in fact, in the foreground of the education of the camp's children. She was quite uneasy with the usual educational materials, which were kind of racist.
Indians are sometimes very cruel.
Books would put down people of other ethnic backgrounds or other races.
The Jews burned sacrifices upon an altar of stone.
It was just so racist and anti-Native American and just kind of over the top.
A teacher at that time taught everything. Territorial laws, government, geography, mathematics, English.
They were learning about civics and spelling and Reading, writing, arithmetic, basically a one-room schoolhouse.
When you've got 6 grades all in one room, it's kind of tough with that age diversity and all those people in there, everyone studying at a different level.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Christian religious instruction played a part in all education at those days because they felt that's what everybody wanted.
You learn to read and write with biblical stories. I'm not sure that Dick and Jane, threw the ball for Spot back in 1876.
A lot of the teaching was Bible-based. The whole concept of separation of church and state just didn't seem to grasp hold at that time.
A lady should not choose a man who chews tobacco.
Instead of a lot of paper, most of the kids would have a portable chalkboard. They'd learn the alphabet, and different letters, and how to pronounce them, how to write them.
Everything was handwritten in those days, and that meant it had to be written so you could read it. You were taught to move your whole arm and make beautiful, round, and readable letters. That was the important thing. It had to be legible.
A lot of the kids were second-generation immigrants. So you'll be teaching kids who speak German at home or Welsh, and then they go to school and they have to do it in English.
The Chinese children that ended up here, they were schooled. They went to the Congregational Church for their schooling, and that's where they learned English.
I don't want to hold her hand.
You can lock arms instead.
Somebody that didn't have any money, if they could clothe their children, could get them to school. And that's a big deal. Especially when you're talking about immigrants who just got off the boat a couple of years before and had no education themselves. They were pretty much in awe of the whole idea.
People that came out here to prospect, to establish their livelihood, they were bringing 2 books with them, the Bible, Shakespeare. Of course, Deadwood had its share of theaters, which were basically brothels and saloons. But also legitimate theater came here, and you have somebody like Jack Langrish, who arrived in 1876 from Cheyenne. And Langrish loved to perform in the West.
Jack Langrish was an Irish immigrant who came to New York. Then he started this touring company. And he started off with a very minimal bunch and ended up with probably the largest touring theater group at that time in the United States.
He was the pioneer theater man. He was talented enough that he could have worked anywhere in the world he wanted to, but he chose the mining frontier. I think he liked the culture, and he liked the idea that he was bringing civilization to these towns.
My last camp, Jack.
As it may be for us all, young man. The place is yearning for elevation and festering with wealth.
We must help them however we can.
The life of a hard rock miner, well, you have to recognize he is in a very dangerous profession. They'd work 12 hours underground, and they'd certainly work 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And it was a rough life.
It's dirty, it's dark, it's dusty, it's wet, and I think in the early days it was about $1 or $2 a day. But that's steady pay, and that's every week, every day.
You stand in cold water all day, playing in dirt. And when you're through in the afternoon, you go back and you get a beer and go watch a play. You can take your mind off of your troubles, and it's just like turning on the television.
Frontier towns, the boom towns of Deadwood, are sorely lacking anything but bawdy houses and gambling halls. That's all they have. People want something beyond that. That sense of civilization, that sense of society.
Both the cattlemen and the miners were surprisingly better read than one imagines. One always imagines to be illiterate, but that isn't the case.
A lot of these people were quite well educated. They just had to leave town, wherever they were from. Dickens made a good buck giving readings, touring the West. Oscar Wilde had wonderfully rewarding pederastic excursions, into mining camps. So there was a real yearning toward that sort of stuff. And Langrish made a real good buck.
Really, it was the miners themselves who made the demand, and Jack Langrish went where the demand was.
As we have in Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco, the Langrish troop bids welcome to the Deadwood camp.
Jack Langrish came to Deadwood and fell in love with it, built himself a theater that was pretty flimsy because the roof fell in on the customers one day. It was raining hard, the roof fell in. They kept on anyway. They didn't quit. And he put on all sorts of shows. They would put on a fresh act every day almost.
You read the list of things they offered, and it's all over the place. They put on shows of Oliver Twist. They put on shows of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then they also put on vaudeville and burlesque. Sometimes they have can-can. So they bring in a variety of stuff.
And of course, there was always the Shakespeare. Apparently, he liked himself performing Shakespeare, though the audience weren't as mad about Shakespeare as he was.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Tonight, we will be the audience to you.
Everyone attended these plays, all the way from the cowboy, the dirt miner, the banker, the restaurant owner, and sometimes the Chinese. The world was Jack's stage, and he entertained the world.
Any society has a lust for entertainment. I think that's a very healthy thing. What's at the essence of it is something which is primitive to what men and women require, which is a sense of a celebration, sometimes, of their lives. And of course, it's quintessential in something like Deadwood, because that's what the miners understood. They understood what their needs were. It's not just enough to fuck, and it's not just enough to pray, and it's not just enough to get drunk. There's something else one requires, and that's what the theater fills.
The fact that Deadwood became a real city with a terrible mix of gangsters and ruffians and low women and businessmen and professional men is, I think, a tribute to the American ability for large numbers of very different people to get along with each other.
All these people come to Deadwood. They're all trying to find their way in the world, trying to make a new life. Ultimately, they can all destroy each other, or they can all form a society that has some sort of law and reason to it that allows them all to, together, under the illusion of law, to find a way to live together. And that's what's constantly going on in the camp.